treat the first 2 months as an extension of the sales process. Instead of selling a membership, we're selling a habit. And what we need to do is we need to be there for our members. We need to guide our members through the early weeks, be it digitally, be it in person. That's up to you as an operator.
This is All Things Fitness and Wellness, uniting industry thought leaders and fitfluencers on the mission to inspire innovation and encourage people to live a life fit and well. Every January, operators see the same pattern, a surge of motivated joiners followed by a steep decline just weeks later. It happens year after year, and it raises an important question. From a behavior science perspective, what does this annual trend reveal about how the industry is approaching early engagement and retention? On this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Heather McKee, a leading behavior change specialist now working with Myzone. We unpack what is actually happening in those first 30 to 60 days, where the biggest gaps appear, and why so many new members begin to drift long before operators notice the signs. Dr. McKee outlines the earliest behavioral indicators of disengagement and how the right data or wearable feedback loops can help teams intervene sooner. Before we get to it, be sure to hit like and subscribe. We have new podcast episodes weekly featuring industry thought leaders and influencers. I'm your host, Krissy Vann, and this is ATFW. This is an interview that I put into motion. We were talking ahead of this a couple of months ago, and it's came to reality at the perfect time. I have Dr. McKee joining me from Myzone, and we're going to be talking all about the member behavior and the science behind it. And the reason why I say the time is now for this conversation is because we know we're heading into those January gym rushes, and operators face the same challenge time and time again. Gyms get packed. And member retention, unfortunately, is the age-old problem, which is why we've all been kind of seeing the same 20% in our doors for years over years. So first of all, thank you so much for making the time and joining us all the way from Ireland.
Thank you, Krissy. No, delighted to be here and delighted to talk about this because this is possibly one of my favorite topics to talk about. And I know, it's top of mind for all operators, all decision makers right now. So delighted to dive in.
I know. I loved when I sent the prep questions and you were like, this is my favorite topic. And It's one you can't go to a conference without it coming up. And we know that operators see that surge in signups, then a steep decline. So obviously we could look at the member and say, behaviorally, there's certain things that are going on with them that cause this behavior. But let's flip the script here on the operator. What does this annual pattern reveal about the underlying issue and how the industry is approaching retention?
The industry as a whole tends to capitalize on what we call in behavioral science the fresh start effect. So that spike that we get in the new year, people sign up, they're full of hope, they see it as a fresh start, they see, they've visualized their future self, moving, exercising, being part of this community. And then without the right habit scaffolding, it kind of collapses over time. And so what this reveals is the industry kind of relies on short-lived extrinsic motivation. So it relies on that hype, that New Year's kind of hustle, rather than actually cultivating sustainable habits. And those kind of over-reliance on those extrinsic goals, it basically undermines long-term adherence. And so while it might get people in the door in January, it also means that more people are going to be leaving by February, March, etc. And so I think ultimately we want to move away from those extrinsic goals like guilt, like just doing it because it's New Year's, just doing it because someone else is doing it, and focus more on actually supporting our members, for a lifelong relationship and journey with well-being, with movement.
I know that we're going to get granular on this through the conversation, but exactly that. The first 30 to 60 days, that drop off is occurring. So what do you see as the biggest gaps that cause these new members to drift? I mean, you're kind of highlighting there that we're basically capitalizing on the wrong goals, but how can operators better protect that early stage revenue?
Yeah, great question. I think there's a lack of like an onboarding structure or habit building journey. Like I work a lot with different apps, and there's so much emphasis on the onboarding because we know from the research that actually that kind of first 90 days is so key in terms of the relationship that we build with the individual, and also the skills that we help them build. I think operators and gyms in general, they're focusing far too much on willpower rather than on developing skill power. So, developing that individual skill, intrinsic motivation, their habit building skills, their accountability skills, understanding what competence means in an exercise or movement journey, understanding how important reflection is, understanding experimentation is important, and most importantly, finding enjoyment in movement. And so I think like some of the biggest gaps are that lack of kind of that focus on that journey at the start, that the goal setting isn't based on enjoyment, identity, or intrinsic motivation. There tends to be a lack of early accountability or reinforcement. So we need a lot of trainer contact, or gym contact or accountability contact early on. And one thing that I notice, Krissy, that often isn't talked about is misaligned intensity. So
Mm.
when people join, a gym for the first time, let's say like a classic gym that's like got machines, it's got a weight through, they go up to the gym floor and they scan the floor and they're like, right, what's the hardest, most difficult thing that I could do? Okay, the Stairmaster, the assault bike. And they go to these things because they think if it's the hardest to do, it's the most beneficial long term. But actually, what we know from the research is this really interesting researcher called Ekikakas, and he's done a lot of research on intensity. And if the intensity feels too hard or isn't stage match or competence match to the individual, so they don't feel confident in their ability to be actually able to execute at that intensity, it means that they're much more likely to drop out, essentially.
Mm.
But so many members don't know this either. So they go in thinking, oh, I need to just push hard, I need to do the HIIT class straight away, I need to get on the assault bike, I need to just feel the burn. And actually educating and helping members understand that actually there are different levels of intensity in movement. And just because it's hard doesn't mean it's good. And actually it's about finding that intensity match that works for you. I was only just reading it last week in a magazine. So Myzone did a study with University of Leeds, and they showed that actually this intensity match is so important. And actually by making the effort visible, people were more likely to engage and have stronger motivation and, interestingly, greater happiness. And what was really interesting about the study for me was that it was these new exercisers. So when they could see that their intensity was at the right level for them, where they could adapt their intensity for the right level for them, they felt much stronger, they felt much more motivated, and ultimately they felt more happy. So I think we need to really focus on preventing this kind of wandering newbie syndrome when people first join, and, kind of support them with the scaffold, the guidance, the early wins, help them understand what intensity works for them, help them understand how to connect with others. And just focus more on the understanding that, someone doesn't just join a gym in January and then it sticks. That's like 2% of the population. The majority of us need that scaffold, we need that support, and we need that in order to be able to come back time and time again.
Obviously, trainer support, as you say, and those touch points are so important. And it makes sense generally when we feel accountable to someone, it really helps fuel us to actually get there. But I like that you highlighted in that study when people could see it and their results. So, talk to me a little bit about the connection when it comes to wearables and where that comes into the equation, because obviously, our touch points now aren't just the person welcoming you into the gym and the trainer on the gym floor, but a lot of facilities are able to build out an ecosystem where, the members are wearing the data on their own wrist or different devices.
Yeah, I think it's another part of the scaffolding. It shouldn't be the one thing that we solely rely on, but it can be such a complement to members. And again, one thing we have to be conscious of is that we're not introducing too many new things at once to members. So if they're a new member, we want to get them engaged with the activities they enjoy at the right intensity first, and then start bringing them into new and interesting things once they feel like they've got enough competence with that. Because what we talk about a lot at MyZone is that there's a huge thing in the fitness community at the moment, which is data overwhelm. I say within the fitness community, but actually beyond it, because I've spent many, many years in university studying all sorts of sports science, exercise psychology, health psychology, and I still feel like I need a degree in statistics to understand half of my wearable data. But if I struggle, how do I expect my mom to be able to actually understand what her HRV means, what contributed towards it, what that poor sleep score actually will result in, or has she overtrained or undertrained? And so I think that we have to understand that data comes with caveats that we have to help people feel competent at the data. Again, and I know obviously I'm hugely biased here, but what I really like about Myzone is it just makes it really simple, and it's like, this is the most meaningful data for you. It's in real time, it's in the workout, it's like you're seeing it's your race, your pace, it's you against you. So we can have a marathon runner next to you and a complete beginner the other side of you, and it doesn't matter, because the person that you're measured against is yourself. And that can help you feel like, I'm getting the most out of this because I'm hitting the right intensity for me at the right time. Helping users understand how they can use their data to their advantage is really, really important, I think. Asking them how they currently use it and what they want to get out of it. But being really streamlined with, if we're using data, if we're using wearables, understanding, what is the most important metric for that member at the stage that they're at right now. And this is where I think often, digital health movement misses the trick, that it's really important to include context. So, for example, I have a 15-month-old baby. And so, while sleep, I would say I have so much reverence for sleep, and, my sleep hygiene is as good as it can be. It isn't necessarily smart for me to be chasing a sleep goal, especially maybe early in my motherhood journey. And so, what is more important that is what's within my control. And so that's where often people go wrong when it comes to actually looking at data. They need to look at what is data is most meaningful for them at the stage that they're at right now, not what is hardest, what's most difficult, what everyone else is doing, but actually what's most meaningful for them. And I think in the gym community, as operators and decision makers, we need to help guide people to what that could be for them. And then having things like Myzone, where you don't even have to think about it, it shows up for you in the moment. It's there. It helps you feel part of the group. It helps you know that you're getting the most out of your workout. Takes away all that cognitive overload in terms of data, and actually turns it into something that is real time and meaningful, and actually helps you enjoy the movement more, which ultimately is what it's all about.
There's so many different things I wanna dive into from that, but the first thing is just on what you ended there in regards to the fact that real-time feedback. So talk to me, because obviously I'm sure there's been plenty of studies, but behaviorally, what does that feedback loop do for a gym goer if they're
Yeah.
actually able to see their progress in real time, in that workout, in that moment?
Yeah, do you know what it is? It's progress is the fuel that keeps the motivation fire burning. And the thing that why people kind of like, I'm going to take a step back and go back to what we talked about first before I kind of fully answer your question, which I promise you I'll get back to. But when New Year's comes around, we throw everything on the kitchen sink at our habits. We think, okay, we're going to go to the gym every day. We're going to cut down on sugar. We're going to give up alcohol, la, la, la. And the more we add in, the more we lead to goal dilution. So it makes us less effective at what we're trying to ultimately achieve. And the thing is, we can only make real progress at one thing at a time. Once you get competent at that, we can add more things in. And at the start, we make a lot of progress. And that's why people stay engaged maybe for those first few weeks, because they're seeing the progress, they're feeling the progress. But what happens then after those kind of first 90 days? And what we see, certainly in the digital health world, is that, people tend to drop off at 8 to 12 weeks in a lot of apps and a lot of wearables. And that's because the progress isn't like, sky high anymore. And I always think about it like, you've got motivation here and you've got habit here. And motivation starts out high and goes down. But habit starts out low, and we want to increase it over time. And that's why we want to have those habit building structures, because habits are formed through something called context dependent repetition. Do the same thing in the same circumstance enough times, it becomes a habit. And so once motivation dips, we want habit to take over. We want the cues to be there, we want the rewards to be there. And I think having that real-time feedback is a real-time reward, but it's also a real-time visual of progress. And regardless of where you are in your fitness journey, you can actually see the progress in that moment. You can see how you're doing well. And that is so, so important to keep engagement going, especially when we get to those tricky dips where maybe we don't feel like we're getting that kind of visceral feedback. So we're not like, breathing maybe as heavy as we did before. Like those are indicators sometimes that we're getting fitter. We're breathing less heavy, or we're sweating less, or whatever else. But once we kind of get past that, how do we know that we're continuing to progress? And that's often a challenge then for people to feel motivated, especially in the weight loss community. We often see when people hit a plateau, they think, oh, well, I'm doing all the things. What am I meant to do now? And ultimately what you're meant to do now is, find the things that you love that don't feel like a chore and keep going with those things. But we're addicted to progress. We want to feel like we're progressing. And so if we can find a way to make that progress tangible, to make it real time rewarding, then it's just going to reinforce that habit loop and actually make it much more likely that person's going to continue to show up.
I love that line. We are addicted to progress. And it makes so much sense too, because of the external reinforcement to drive us to feel like we're not progressing and constantly have to be in a state of achieving. When you think of
Mm,
what social media is influencing most
yeah.
consumers, right? It's kind of always showing us where we lack and where we stack up. And unfortunately, it does have positive connotations, obviously, in the sense it could be a motivator and a driver. And then on the flip side, it can be a negative where you're constantly feeling like I have to achieve, I have to achieve. And if you're not seeing those results, as you say, and you have that plateau moment, it's kind of easy for people to give up. But the other element that you had said in your comment before was about this data overwhelm.
Mm,
And it does make so much sense that users, you get a cool new wearable for Christmas and yay, it can do this, it can do that. But what does that actually mean for me? I feel like operators are in a similar situation right now where we're becoming more and more rich in data and knowing more about member behavior. And there's been
mm.
many conversations this year about tech stacks and AI and different tools that can predict if a member is going to churn. But what are the actual earliest behavioral signals that a member is beginning to disengage, and how can operators detect those signals when they have the right data?
Yeah, a great question. And I think this really feeds into, what we're trying to do in terms of motivational technology. So we're trying to look at what motivates people and engages them more than, all of these, like you say, extrinsic metrics that might be less meaningful for people. And I think key things are, intensity and frequency. So if someone shows up and they're showing up in, like, so let's say they come a lot of times, like early in January, those are kind of, red flags for that people. And so what we need to really know from that individual is, when are they most likely to go to the gym? And what I mean by that is, like, how does it work in terms of their greater life setup? So what we know from the research is friction is really, really important to build habits, but also to stop us engaging in helpful habits too. And so we need to know things like, and I know that you're probably thinking, how does this relate to motivation? How does this relate to the key metrics that we should be looking at? The proximity that someone has to their gym, to their studio, to their place of movement has a outsized impact on their frequency of engagement. And it is so, so important to really understand, is this actually going to be someone that's going to show up? Is it difficult for them to get to here? Do they do it as part of their commute? Do they do it as part of that? Is actually a really important metric to really understand and know. Another thing is, one thing that I'd always want to know is from members is, why are they here in the first place? What's motivated them to come here? That really taps into intrinsic motivation, and helps us understand if members are aligned with extrinsic or intrinsic. And members can start out extrinsically motivated. They might be there for weight loss reasons, for long-term health reasons, but actually then that gives us a flag to say, okay, well, these are members that we really need to talk with. These are members that maybe really need to experiment with different type of movements and different types of ways to engage with movements in order for them to understand what intrinsically motivates them. Because those members that are kind of showing up for those extrinsic reasons are much more likely to pick the wrong intensity, to do the more punishing classes, to think that they have to come at a certain frequency, otherwise they don't engage at all. So I think it's really, really important to actually tap into that as well. One thing that's really important as well is competence. Again, I'd love to ask members, what's the first thing you plan to do when you arrive? New members. And that kind of reveals where they're at in terms of their competency, in terms of their exercise history, in terms of actually their understanding of what's important to them. And then at Myzone, one thing that we're measuring is all of the key needs that fuel this long-term motivation. And it's a theory called self-determination theory. And basically, when people are more self-determined, they have more intrinsic motivation. They're doing it for them. So they understand what contribution getting active, staying active makes to their life. And so what we're really interested in is those three basic needs that fuel any individual's motivation. So those needs are autonomy, so feeling like you've got ownership or choice; competence, so feeling like you're understanding of what you're doing and you're feeling like you're progressing; and then relatedness, so feeling like that you're understood by vital others, and that you're connected to others, you're part of something bigger than yourself. And so I feel like even if operators just measured those three elements, they get a huge insight into who's going to stay and who's going to drop out, because these are the things that fuel long-term engagement. And there's over 40 years of research looking at, how do we enhance these, and when these needs are met, it's much more likely that these people are going to come back time again. And so I really feel like, for so long we focus on those outcome measures, and now we need to go back and need to look at the process, because goals are just a snapshot in time. They're only a one-time event, but ultimately what we need to understand is the processes and how to get actually people excited, how to make them frictionless, and actually ultimately how to nourish our members in a way that actually they will gain that intrinsic motivation. They'll fall in love with movement, they'll fall in love with the studio or the gym, and they'll make it part of them, and ultimately those are the people that will stick with it for life.
Well, and when it comes to need nourishment, I think one of the elements that we've heard talked about more and more, because let's face it, the ads before, and not even, you don't even have to go that far back, but the ads for joining a gym even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if we start to get to when I was in high school and the types of ads, it was all, I mean, shockingly shaming your
Mm,
audience into the doors kind of vibe. And luckily, we've expanded our knowledge over, yes, physical health and what we need to do, but mental health being a huge driver. But even more so, the conversation started to really shift and center around our social wellness.
mm,
And, you and I were talking before we hopped on here. I live in the city of Vancouver. One of the most common conversations is our lack of third spaces. You also have a population when it comes to Gen Zs, which we know are our largest sector that's walking in the gym doors. Well, a lot of Gen Z is moving away from alcohol, therefore not going out to bars and not going out to the clubs. So there's tremendous opportunity. But I'm just curious from a behavior standpoint, how
mm.
important is it to generate kind of these micro communities in your gym doors and that sense of belonging for a member? How important is creating a sense of belonging in your gym doors, and how can operators effectively capitalize and do that for their members?
Yeah, that's such a great flag. I would say it's vital. Um, Ultimately, it's like described there, relatedness is one of the needs. Like, we've all seen it. When we went through COVID, we need to feel in community with others. Now, the way that that shows up doesn't always have to be in the same way for each individual. But when we feel like we're part of something, when we feel like we belong, then we engage time and time again. The key here is helping people at all levels of fitness feel like they belong. Because for so long, as you've rightly flagged, that we focus on the fittest fit. And one of the main barriers that people don't engage, in the gym community, in the studio community, is because they don't feel like people like them go. And especially those harder to reach people, the people that we really want to engage in movement. Maybe they've have a less positive exercise history, maybe they've had a less positive body image history, all of these things. We really want to make and help people feel like they belong. And so I think it's really, really important that operators don't just look at their fittest fit and don't just reward their fittest fit members. Actually look at those people all along the spectrum of fitness and actually adapt for those individuals as well. Because, and what does that look like? It might look like offering kind of an experimentation week where people can try on a class for 10 minutes at a time, or try on different equipment, or, they might want to work with, one of your kind of really engaged members that's actually kind of similar to them, or they might want to work with a trainer that just feels really relatable. But there's this thing in exercise psychology called vicarious experience. If we can see others that we recognize are similar to us actually achieving a goal, it makes it much more likely that we'll want to take part, because we feel like we're part of something. And I think that's why it's one thing I love about Myzone is it kind of democratizes fitness. Like I said, you can be in a spin class, let's say, and you can have someone that goes like 5 times a week next to you and someone who goes once a week next to you. It doesn't matter because you're all competing against yourselves. And so it helps you feel like you're part of the tribe regardless of where your fitness is at. But I think it's often something that's ignored by gyms. And a great way to do this, and a lot of kind of clubs offer like free smoothies as a reward, or these different kind of extrinsic rewards, which like long term aren't going to engage someone in movement, but actually by offering it like kind of at the end of a movement session, or at the end of a class, that offers members a kind of new way of thinking of, oh, we finish a class and actually we kind of go here together, we go as a group. It's something we've seen in our studies with people with long-term chronic conditions. So I ran this piece of work where we looked at people with lung conditions all over the UK. And one of the most important things if you've got a long-term lung condition is to keep moving. But it's the most terrifying thing because you can't breathe properly. And one of the best ways to keep people engaged in their movement practices was to offer tea and coffees at the end of a session. Because it's those people that made friends, those people that felt like they were part of something, those people that were able to connect with others and not just see them as, that intimidating fit guy or girl or whoever they came up against. Actually, those are the people that stayed engaged because they felt like there was a part of a community. And so, I think helping cultivate a community that's beyond just nourishing those super fit individuals is really, really important, and where a lot of kind of operators miss a beat.
Yeah, my brain instantly goes to one personal story. I think of my grandfather. He never was a gym goer. He wasn't a large guy, but ran into heart troubles when he was older. And he ended up joining by doctor's orders this thing called Happy Hearts at the time, which was an exercise group. But it changed his whole life because they would go and then have the coffee after, made a whole community of friends. As he was nearing 80, he had all these new faces in his
I love
life.
that.
And the byproduct of that, he loved going. It was the best
Mm,
thing in his day. My mom, pickleball, her gateway drug into the gym. She's in her
yay.
60s, first time she's ever gone religiously to a gym. And to your point, once she had community that built in, other pickleball goers, picklers,
Yeah.
like, I need to learn my terminology before I go for Christmas because she has a mean serve and I only play on occasion. However, it's through them. Like, I love what you said about the modeling of other people. It's other women
Mm,
her age, but they do different classes. And so even though she had never dipped her toe, they then became the ones that were her entrance into that door. And my mom now goes 5 days a week from a zero
ever adhered to anything. Like, I love that woman. She's done amazing things in her life, but that was a habit that was her whole life. She never, ever was able to build. And
Wow.
then I look at a program that we have here in British Columbia. It's a live well exercise clinic. And same thing, it's different patients that have had a medical, it could be lung, it could be heart, what have you. But it's become this community group on top of it. And it's just interesting as you say it. I'm like, maybe we have a lot to learn over how we treat our elders in that type of facility, in
Mm,
that type of situation, and translate it, because at the end of the day, the core is we all want sense of belonging. We all want
mm,
community. And we're in a time in the world, I think we're more starved for that than ever,
yeah.
unless you're an ultra extrovert that's pounding the pavement. We spend most of the days locked in these. Gosh, I need to clean my phone
Mm.
screen. Because clearly I'm guilty. But I'm like, it is so true. So I really appreciate what you highlighted there. But, there's a lot of talk about investing in new tools for operators or different amenities that enhance the
Mm.
member experience. But a lot of them have little impact on behavior. So, what are the most common misplaced investments that don't move the needle on retention? Like, is there a direction that you see a lot of operators invest in that may be better spent if they want to have members stick to their goals and ultimately continue paying their dues?
Yeah, great question. Gosh, I think, well, we just discussed one there. Like a lot of operators, invest in G bars, but they don't utilize them in a way that they can be a social tool. Tagging, having a class that actually, like a phrase that we hear, well, a lot in the fitness community in London is a Barry's and brunch. People go for Barry's boot camp and they go for a brunch. And I just think that is just a wonderful way of kind of packaging the two things together. And if we can get more classes or more sessions in the gym that are kind of tagged on, so that it doesn't become a heavy lift on the individual or on the member, because a lot of these social bits, a lot of it is reliant on the member to actually have the motivation to actually go and do the things. Whereas actually, if we can take that away and actually use the facilities that we have, most operators will have a facility or a place where people can have a tea or a coffee, or juice, or even just a water, like just a small space where there is allowance for time for people to chat, time for people to connect. And it's so interesting because even we've seen this time and time again in behavioral research studies. So there's a really interesting study where they have this train, and they have on the train, they have a quiet cart and they have a chatty cart. And they ask people before they go on, like, what cart would they prefer? But they still put a lot of people in the chatty cart, even though they prefer the quiet cart. And they measure their well-being. And despite the fact that they wanted to be in quiet, those that were actually in the chatty cart tend to have a spike in their well-being, even if it's just a small conversation that they've had with someone else. It lifts them. And so providing these kind of micro opportunities doesn't require, necessarily a fancy tech or fancy equipment. It requires just being able to kind of gather around in some space. You see it a lot in yoga retreats. They offer a hot drink at the end, and it's just a lovely way to kind of debrief with everyone. And they bake that into the time that's available. That doesn't necessarily need to cost you more. And people don't, again, it's the frequent flyers. The people that are really engaged are the people that are going to care about the fancy equipment or the new upgrades. But if we're trying to attract those people that actually go less often, or new members, it's often, those community leavers that actually are much more likely to engage them. And that doesn't necessarily need to require more money. I would say as well, getting people to use wearables that don't really have, that real-time impact, or they can't read or understand the data. If they don't have that kind of coaching layer, that again is a wasted opportunity as well, because they need to enhance their ability to stick with their movement, not distract from it. Like I said, if we add too many goals in, it takes away from the focal goal. And so we need that tech with feedback. We need to have that instant feedback to understand our progress, or we need that tech with a social layer. That's kind of what enhances that behavior change engine. What we've seen in Myzone is that people with 4 or more social interactions on the app they're much more likely to have higher, so what we call Myzone effort points. So they're much more likely to engage in more movement and stay engaged in movement for longer. So we need to actually be really careful with our tech and make sure that it's giving the right type of feedback that doesn't distract, but actually enhances what we're doing. So I would say don't waste your money on fancy equipment if we're trying to attract new members or retain those large group of our community that might not be as frequent as others. Let's focus on the social side. Let's focus on actually providing that structure, providing layers of feedback, providing opportunities. One thing gyms could really do with investing is actually more people on the floor to talk to the members, to make them feel like they're part of the community, to help them out. Even just to ask them, what they watched last night, what's their favorite show on Netflix, like stupid things, but actually having someone there that someone can chat to just creates that community feel, helps with that sense of belonging, and makes it much more likely that that person will come back time and again.
What seems like the most obvious basic touch point also can be the thing that we get distracted from. At the end of the day, you're also offering customer service and a customer experience in order to maintain that relationship. But it kind of, if all of a sudden their first interaction when they walk in your gym is your front desk and they're texting so-and-so on the phone or things like that, I'm like, that's where you actually can all of a sudden create an instant disconnect. You highlighted some of them there, but to round off our conversation, if you were advising a leadership team setting its 2026 strategy, what single behavior first initiative would have the strongest effect on reducing the annual drop off?
It's going to be hard for me to be succinct, as you can tell.
It's a podcast. You're allowed to let it breathe. So
Yeah. I think we need to treat the first 2 months as an extension of the sales process. Instead of selling a membership, we're selling a habit. And what we need to do is we need to be there for our members. We need to guide our members through the early weeks, be it digitally, be it in person. That's up to you as an operator. But ultimately, I would encourage in-person and digital where it enhances and doesn't take away from the focal goal. But we need to be there. We need to help them understand what intensity works for them, what movements they enjoy the most. We need to help them feel super competent. We need to help them understand other people that are like them, that actually, are engaged. We need to provide social opportunities for them to engage with others from the gym. It's like, we need to treat it like making a new friend rather than it just being solely a business interaction. Because ultimately, the people that you meet in the gym or the studio, if you show up year after year, like they're your friends for life. And so why not approach it from the point of view of creating that relationship? Let's celebrate, early wins, small wins. Let's not focus necessarily on intensity above everything else. It's actually about finding out for that member what works for them. If we could, I'm really greedy now. My Christmas list is, my wish list for 2026 is really long. But if we could encourage just experimentation and reflection, those two things are going to have a huge impact on the member, because they don't feel like then they have to do things perfectly all the time. They feel like there's options to find what works for them. And that might be in terms of what class they go to, what equipment they use, but it also might be in terms of what time of day they go to the gym. Is it the morning? Is it the afternoon? Is it after work? Is it on the weekends? Experimenting with all of that, because one of the biggest things that throws people off is we have such a perfectionist mindset about health, about well-being, about movement. And so if we can kind of help them normalize failure is a normal part of this whole journey, and actually the way to overcome failure is to experiment, reflect, and find the movement type, the movement intensity, and the time of day that works best for you. That's way more habit forming. So ultimately, it'll be a behavior first initiative that's much more focused on, habit formation, building that structure, that scaffold that someone needs in those kind of first 90 days, in those first 2 months. So I would hope that people would have great success in creating, movers for life.
Dr. Heather McKee, I'm so glad that we got connected. Thank you so much for joining me on ATFW.
Krissy, thank you. Thank you so much for your questions. They really made me think. And yeah, there's a lot in there that people can gain from adding behavioral science into their workflows.
You've just listened to the All Things Fitness and Wellness podcast, hosted by Krissy Vann. Be sure to hit like and subscribe. We have new podcast episodes weekly featuring industry insiders and influencers. Together, we're on a mission for everyone to live a life fit and well.